Everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down the day I realized my wife, Jessica, wasn't who I believed her to be. I'm Matt, 28 years old, and up until recently, I was the guy who thought he had the perfect marriage. We were planning to start a family. My wife was always talking about how much she looked forward to being a mother, and I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But I was wrong. So very wrong. Jessica had always been the kind of woman who lived for family. She checked in on her parents every day, pushed me to stay connected with my own, and when her mother got sick, it made sense that she would step up to take care of her. The long weekends she spent at her parents' place were hard, but I didn't mind at first. I trusted her completely. How could I not? She was my wife. Yet, something started gnawing at me. It began as a whisper in the back of my mind, easily dismissed at first. The trips to her parents' house, only a couple of hours away, started becoming more frequent. She'd leave on Friday, sometimes Thursday, and wouldn't return until late Sunday, or even Monday morning. Jessica had always been exhausted after these visits, but lately, she seemed different. Like she wasn't just tired, but disconnected, distant. I tried to shake the feeling, convincing myself that it was just the stress of her mother's illness. But the pit in my stomach didn't go away. One Monday, after she'd been gone all weekend, Jessica casually mentioned she needed to leave again that Wednesday. My heart dropped. Something was wrong. I could feel it now. I asked her why she had to go so soon again. She blinked, as if the question caught her off guard, and stammered that her parents needed more help. But her tone was off. My gut was screaming at me. Something wasn't right. I told her I needed her here too. We were trying to start a family, and she wasn't around enough for that. Jessica hesitated, and then she apologized. She said her parents really needed her, but she would stay home until Friday. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And in that moment, I knew there was more to this story. By the time Friday rolled around, something inside me was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being played, that there was something happening beneath the surface that I just wasn't seeing. I tried to act normal, but the questions wouldn't leave me alone. What was really going on during these trips? Jessica packed her things that morning, humming a tune while she got ready to leave. She was being casual, almost too casual. I watched her closely, trying to pick up any clue that would give away her real intentions. I felt like I was losing my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I kissed her goodbye like I always did and watched her drive off. But this time, as soon as she was out of sight, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the tracker app I'd installed on her car a few weeks earlier. I told myself it was just for safety, something to keep tabs on her long drives to her parents' place. But in that moment, I knew why I had really done it. I needed answers. I waited for the app to load, my heart pounding in my chest, and watched as the little blue dot moved along the highway. She was heading in the right direction, just as she always did. I felt a small wave of relief wash over me, but it didn't last long. Something inside me wasn't convinced. My gut was screaming that I needed to dig deeper. Hours passed, and the tension in my body only grew worse. I checked the tracker again, and sure enough, she was at her parents' house. But instead of feeling better, I felt more on edge. Something still didn't feel right. Why was she so distant? Why did she seem so eager to leave lately? I couldn't stay still any longer. I decided to call her. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before she finally picked up. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice cheerful, almost too cheerful. "How's everything going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, you know, the usual. Helping mom and dad around the house, keeping things in order. It's been pretty tiring." There was a slight pause before she added, "I'll probably stay here until Sunday again." My stomach twisted. "You've been spending so much time over there," I said, trying to sound casual. "Are you sure everything's all right?" There was another pause, longer this time. "Yeah, everything's fine, Matt." Why? I wanted to ask her so many things. Why she was pulling away, why she was gone so often, why I felt like she wasn't being honest with me. But I held back. "I just miss you, that's all." "I miss you too," she replied, but something about her tone felt hollow. I could hear it now. The distance wasn't just physical anymore. Something was happening behind my back, and I was starting to feel like I was the only one who didn't know what it was. That weekend dragged on longer than any I can remember. Every minute felt like an eternity, with my mind running wild. I tried to distract myself, watched TV, did some yard work, even caught up with a few friends over beers. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something was deeply wrong. Sunday evening rolled around, and just like clockwork, Jessica came home. But something was different this time. Her smile, which used to light up the room, now felt rehearsed, like she was putting on a show. She kissed me on the cheek, barely making contact, and told me she was exhausted from the weekend. I wanted to believe her, but her words didn't match her eyes. They seemed distant, like she wasn't really here with me anymore. I didn't say anything, but I knew. I knew something was off, and I was tired of pretending everything was fine. We sat down for dinner that night, the silence between us louder than ever before. The clinking of silverware was the only sound as we ate in uncomfortable quiet. I tried to make small talk, but she seemed distracted, lost in her own world. My frustration boiled under the surface, but I kept it locked away, not ready to let it out just yet. After dinner, I watched her as she moved around the house. She looked like she was going through the motions, cleaning up, folding laundry, but she was somewhere else entirely in her mind. I wondered where that place was. Who was she thinking about? What was she hiding from me? That night, when we went to bed, I couldn't take it anymore. The questions had been building inside me, and they were ready to explode. As she climbed into bed beside me, I turned toward her. "Jess, we need to talk." She froze for a second, then slowly turned to face me. "About what?" she asked, her voice too calm. "I don't know. Us," I replied, my voice shaking with the tension I'd been bottling up. "You've been distant. I know you've been stressed with your mom and all, but something's not right. You're not here with me anymore." Her expression hardened for a split second, but she quickly masked it with a small smile. "Matt, I'm just tired. It's been a lot with my mom being sick. You know that." "I get that," I said, "but it feels like you're slipping away. You're always gone, and when you're here, it's like you're somewhere else." I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked with the weight of my suspicion. "I feel like I'm losing you," Jessica sighed, looking away from me. "You're not losing me. You're just being paranoid," she muttered. There it was. That word, paranoid. It stung, but deep down, it confirmed everything I feared. I wasn't paranoid. I was right. Something was happening, and she wasn't going to admit it, at least not yet. She rolled over, turning her back to me. "I'm going to sleep, Matt. We can talk in the morning," she said coldly. But I knew there wouldn't be any talking in the morning. Not about this. Jessica had just drawn a line, and I was left standing on the other side, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind was spinning, replaying every odd moment, every distant look, every time Jessica had pulled away from me lately. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that I was just overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The next morning, I got up early, leaving Jessica asleep in bed. I needed to clear my head. As I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced down and saw an unfamiliar name pop up, Jake. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Jake? I didn't know anyone named Jake. My hands felt suddenly cold as I reached for my phone and opened the message. "Hey Matt, we need to talk." "It's about Jessica." My heart nearly stopped. I read the message over and over, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe this guy Jake had the wrong number. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But then he sent another message. "I'm not comfortable talking about this over text. Can we meet in person?" What the hell was this? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Why was some stranger texting me about my wife? And why did he want to meet in person? My mind jumped to all sorts of conclusions, none of them good. Was this guy some kind of stalker? Was Jessica in trouble? Or was it something else? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands as I typed out a response. "What do you need to talk about? Is everything okay?" Jake didn't respond right away. I stared at my phone, the seconds feeling like hours as I waited. When the reply finally came through, it hit me like a ton of bricks. It's about her and me. You deserve to know the truth. My stomach dropped. My heart was racing now, my mind spinning in a million directions. Her and him? What the hell was he talking about? I could barely think straight, but I knew I needed to know what he was trying to say. Where do you want to meet? I sent back, my fingers trembling over the screen. Jake suggested a small cafe, not too far from my house. The moment I hit send, agreeing to the meeting, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had no idea what I was about to walk into, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. This wasn't the kind of message you got unless something terrible was going on. Jessica was still asleep when I left the house. I couldn't even look at her. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove to the cafe, the walls of the car feeling like they were closing in on me. What if she had been lying to me this whole time? What if those weekends she spent away weren't really about taking care of her mom? By the time I arrived at the cafe, I was barely holding it together. My hands were shaking, and my mouth was dry. I didn't know who this Jake guy was, but I needed answers now. I walked inside, scanning the room until I saw him. Jake was sitting alone at a table in the corner, fidgeting nervously. He looked up when I approached, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, sizing each other up. He didn't look like a threat, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. I sat down across from him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "All right," I said, my voice low. "What's this about? What do you know about Jessica?" Jake swallowed hard, looking down at his hands for a moment before finally meeting my eyes. "I've been seeing Jessica for the last few months," he said, his voice shaky. It felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under me. Everything inside me went numb. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just stared at him, the weight of his words crushing down on me. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared for any of it. For what felt like an eternity, I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. My entire world had just been turned upside down with one simple sentence. "I've been seeing Jessica for the last few months." The words echoed in my head like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I had to grip the edge of the table just to keep myself steady. Jake, sitting across from me, looked pale and nervous, like he was waiting for me to explode. Maybe he expected me to lunge across the table and punch him in the face. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to scream at him, tell him he was lying, that he had to be lying. But another part of me, the part that was trying to piece everything together, knew he wasn't. Jessica's distance, her strange behavior, her eagerness to leave the house, it all fit. My mouth was dry, and when I finally managed to speak, my voice came out low and strained. "What do you mean you've been seeing her?" I asked, my throat tight with anger and disbelief. Jake looked down at the table, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't know she was married, man. I swear. She told me she was single." He glanced up at me again, his eyes filled with regret. "I wouldn't have. I didn't know." My hands clenched into fists under the table. I wanted to believe he was lying, but deep down, I could tell he was being honest. There was no way he could make this up. "How did you find out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed heavily. "Facebook," he muttered. "I found your profile by accident. It suggested you as a friend, and that's when I saw pictures of you and her. That's when I realized she'd been lying to me, too." My heart pounded in my chest, rage bubbling up inside me. "How long has this been going on?" "A few months," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I thought she was serious about me. I mean, we spent a lot of time together whenever she was in town, and I didn't think she was hiding anything from me. She said she was taking care of her sick mom whenever she couldn't meet up, but now I'm starting to realize that was just an excuse to see both of us." I sat there, staring at him, my mind racing. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Jessica had been lying to me for months. She'd created a whole separate life with this guy, and I had no idea. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was living another life. I leaned back in my chair, my mind numb. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why didn't you just confront her?" Jake's face softened. "Because you deserve to know the truth. I didn't want to keep being a part of her lie, and I couldn't just let you live in the dark while she played us both. You deserved better than that." I stared at him, feeling a strange mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, sadness, and a sliver of respect. This guy didn't have to come to me. He could have just walked away and left me in the dark. But instead, he had the guts to tell me the truth, even though it meant dragging both of us through hell. I swallowed hard, my mind still trying to make sense of everything. "So, what now?" I asked, not even sure if I was asking him or myself. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's up to you, man. I didn't want to make any moves without telling you first. I figured we should figure this out together." Together. It felt strange thinking that I was teaming up with the guy my wife had been cheating on me with. But what choice did I have? Jessica had been lying to both of us, and now the truth was out. We were both victims of her betrayal. I nodded slowly, the gears in my mind turning as I tried to figure out what to do next. One thing was for sure: Jessica had no idea what was coming. The drive back home was a blur. I don't even remember getting in my car, but somehow, I found myself parked outside my house, staring at the front door like it was some kind of trap. My stomach was churning, my heart pounding in my chest. Jessica was inside, probably going about her day like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been living a lie. I sat there for a while, trying to gather my thoughts, but everything was spinning out of control. I couldn't believe I was even considering teaming up with Jake, the guy who'd been seeing my wife. But what choice did I have? He was right. We needed to figure this out together. She had been lying to both of us, playing us like fools, and it was time for her lies to come crashing down. I finally forced myself to get out of the car. As I walked up to the door, my legs felt heavy, like I was dragging the weight of everything I just learned with me. I opened the door quietly, half expecting to see Jessica standing there with a guilty look on her face. But she wasn't. She was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made herself a cup of coffee. The sight of her standing there, so casual, so normal, made my blood boil. How could she act like this, like everything was fine? How could she look me in the eyes every day and pretend that nothing was wrong? I clenched my fists, trying to calm myself. I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had a plan, not until I was ready to blow this whole thing wide open. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen, forcing a smile onto my face. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding a little too casual. Jessica turned and smiled at me, the same smile I'd fallen for years ago. But now, it felt like a mask hiding all the lies she'd been telling. "Hey, how's your day going?" she asked, as if everything was perfectly normal. "Not bad," I lied, grabbing a cup from the cupboard and pouring myself some coffee. I leaned against the counter, watching her closely. She was so calm, so collected. If I didn't know what I knew now, I might have believed her act. But now, every move she made, every word she spoke, felt like a reminder of her betrayal. We made small talk for a few minutes, just the usual stuff, nothing that mattered. But inside, I was screaming. Every word out of her mouth was like a jab to the gut, knowing that she was hiding so much from me. "I've been thinking," I said, keeping my tone light, "maybe we should invite your family over this weekend. You know, for a barbecue. We haven't had a proper get-together in a while." Jessica blinked, clearly surprised. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, that sounds nice," she said, though I could see the wheels turning in her head. "I'm sure they'd love that." She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. There was something off, something nervous about the way she agreed. Maybe she knew. Maybe she could sense that the walls were closing in, but she didn't push back. She probably thought she still had everything under control. I nodded, pretending like everything was fine, but my mind was already racing. The barbecue would be the perfect opportunity. I'd get her entire family there, the people she loved and cared about the most, and then I'd expose her lies in front of everyone. She wouldn't be able to escape this time. No more excuses, no more running off to help her mom. The truth would finally come out. I needed to talk to Jake. As soon as Jessica left the room, I pulled out my phone and sent him a quick message. "It's happening. Barbecue this weekend. Be ready." Jake responded almost immediately. "I'll be there." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. In just a few days, everything would come crashing down. I didn't know how it would go, or what kind of mess we'd be walking into. But one thing was certain, Jessica had no idea what was coming her way. The week leading up to the barbecue felt like it was dragging, each day heavier than the last. I could barely look at Jessica without feeling the weight of what was coming. She went about her days like nothing was wrong, smiling, making small talk, going through the motions. But for me, every moment was a reminder of her betrayal. Every time she laughed or kissed me on the cheek, it felt like a dagger in my back. I spent the days planning, going over every detail in my head. I wanted everything to be perfect. This wasn't just about confronting her. It was about showing her that she couldn't hide from her lies anymore. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her betrayal in front of the people she cared about most. Her family, the ones she held in such high regard, would be there to witness it all. Jake and I were in constant contact, coordinating the plan. He was nervous, and I could tell he still felt conflicted about showing up, but we both knew it had to be done. She had deceived both of us, and it was time for her to face the consequences. Finally, the day arrived. The morning of the barbecue, Jessica seemed in a great mood. She was bustling around the house, prepping food, making sure everything was ready. I played along, pretending like this was just another gathering, but inside, my heart was racing. Around noon, her family started to arrive. Her parents, her siblings, their spouses, and kids. It was a full house. Jessica was in her element, chatting with everyone, laughing and making sure everything was perfect. To everyone else, she was the same old Jessica, the loving daughter, the doting wife. But I knew better now. I saw her for what she really was. As the afternoon wore on, I kept my eyes on the driveway, waiting for Jake to show up. I hadn't told Jessica about him, of course. To her, this was just a casual family barbecue. She had no idea that the man she'd been seeing behind my back was about to walk through that door. Finally, I saw his car pull up. My pulse quickened as I watched him get out of the car, his face tense but determined. This was it, the moment we'd been waiting for. I made my way through the crowd of family members, weaving through the conversations and laughter, until I found Jessica by the grill. She was flipping burgers, smiling and talking to her brother. For a moment, I almost hated what I was about to do. She looked so normal, so happy. But then I remembered the lies, the betrayal, and the months of deceit. She deserved every bit of what was coming. "Hey, Jess," I said, my voice steady but my heart pounding. "I've got someone I'd like you to meet." Jessica looked up, surprised. "Oh, who is it?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned toward the edge of the yard, where Jake was walking up. He looked calm on the surface, but I could see the tension in his eyes. Jessica followed my gaze, and as soon as she saw him, her entire body stiffened. For a moment, she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, her eyes darting between me and Jake. The shock on her face was everything I had hoped for. Her hand tightened around the spatula she was holding, and I could see the panic rising behind her eyes. "Jessica," I said slowly, drawing the attention of her family, "I believe you've already met Jake." The air grew thick with silence. Her family, who had been chatting and laughing only moments before, all turned to look at us. Jessica's face went pale. Her brother, still standing beside her, looked confused. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between us. Jake stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been seeing Jessica for the last few months," he said, his voice carrying over the now silent yard. "I didn't know she was married until recently. I thought it was time her family knew the truth." There it was, everything laid out in the open, the weight of her deception crashing down all at once. Jessica's reaction was instant. No, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice shaking with desperation. She dropped the spatula and took a step toward Jake, reaching out like she could somehow stop him from speaking. But it was too late. The truth was already out. Her mother, sitting at the picnic table nearby, looked like she had just been slapped. "Jessica," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is this true?" Jessica turned to her, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mom, I can explain, Explain." Her mother cut her off, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "How could you do this? To Matt?" To your family? The rest of her family stood there in stunned silence, watching as Jessica's perfect image shattered before their eyes. I could see the pain in her siblings' faces, the disappointment in her father's eyes. But Jessica, she just stood there, crying, her hands shaking as she tried to come up with some kind of excuse, some way to make this all go away. But there was no escape now. She was caught. And for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was out, and she had nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed Jake's confession was suffocating. Everyone stood frozen, processing what they had just heard. Jessica's perfect world, the one she had so carefully crafted, was crumbling right in front of her, and there was no way for her to piece it back together. She stumbled toward her mother, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. "Mom, please, it's not what you think." Her mother stood up abruptly, her face pale and drawn with disbelief. "Not what we think," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been lying to all of us. Using me, using my illness, as an excuse to betray your husband." Jessica's lip quivered. "I was going to stop, I swear. I never meant for it to go this far." Her eyes darted to me, but I just stared at her coldly, my heart hardened by the weight of her betrayal. There was nothing she could say to undo the damage now. Nothing that would erase what she had done. Her brother, who had been standing in stunned silence, stepped forward, his face tight with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you, Jess?" he demanded. "You've been sneaking around behind Matt's back while pretending to be the perfect wife? How could you do this to him? To us?" Jessica tried to respond, but her words caught in her throat, swallowed by the sobs that were now shaking her body. She turned to Jake, her eyes pleading. "Jake, please, you didn't have to do this. I was going to explain everything to you." "I was." Jake's expression remained firm, his voice steady. "You already lied enough. I'm not here to protect your secrets anymore." Her face crumpled, and she buried her hands in her face, sobbing uncontrollably. The Jessica I once knew, the strong, confident woman who had always held herself together, was unraveling in front of everyone. Her family, who had always admired her, now looked at her with a mixture of shock, disappointment, and disgust. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction watching it all unfold. For months, I had been left in the dark, deceived by the person I trusted most. Now, she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. And it wasn't just me she had hurt. She had let down her entire family. Jessica's father, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice gruff and filled with disappointment. "You lied to your husband, to your family. And for what? Some fling with a stranger?" Jessica shook her head desperately, trying to wipe away her tears. "Dad, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just felt so much pressure. The pressure to be perfect, to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother." Her voice cracked as she glanced at me again, her face flushed with shame. "And when we started trying for a baby, I panicked. I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just let her words hang in the air, her desperate attempt to explain herself doing little to ease the pain. She had panicked? That's why she had lied to me, cheated on me, created an entirely separate life." Her sister stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "So, you ran off with another guy? How does that make any sense, Jess?" Jessica's sobs grew louder, and she sank to her knees, her head bowed in shame. "I didn't know how to stop," she whispered through her tears. "I didn't know how to get out of it. I was already in too deep." Her mother turned away, shaking her head. "You've broken this family," she muttered, her voice choked with emotion. "You've lied to all of us. And for what? Because you were scared?" The weight of Jessica's betrayal was crushing, not just for me, but for everyone around her. Her siblings couldn't even look at her. Her father clenched his fists in frustration. Her mother, she just stood there, broken, as the truth of what her daughter had done settled in. I glanced over at Jake. He was standing off to the side, quiet, his face a mixture of regret and relief. This wasn't easy for him either, but I could see in his eyes that he knew this was the right thing to do. He wasn't the enemy here. We were both victims of Jessica's lies, and now, finally, the truth was out. The barbecue was over. The cheerful atmosphere, the laughter, the family togetherness, gone in an instant. One by one, her family members started leaving, shaking their heads in disbelief as they walked away. Her mother refused to even look at her as she left. I stood there for a moment, watching Jessica collapse in on herself, broken and alone. Part of me felt sorry for her, sorry for the mess she had made of her life. But a bigger part of me felt relief. This was over. The lies, the betrayal, all of it. It was finally over. I turned and walked toward the house, leaving her sobbing in the yard, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the barbecue were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet moments that stretched into hours. Jessica had left that night, taking her things with her, though she didn't have much to say before she walked out the door. There wasn't anything left to say, really. The silence between us had spoken louder than words ever could. I was numb for the first few days, trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. It was like my whole life had been flipped upside down in an instant. One moment, I was a husband, building a future with the woman I loved. The next, I was staring down the barrel of a divorce, picking up the pieces of a life that I wasn't sure had ever been real. The house felt emptier now, quieter. Without Jessica around, there was this strange, heavy stillness that hung in the air. I had always thought of our home as a place filled with love and warmth, but now it just felt hollow. Like everything I thought I knew was just an illusion, and the reality was colder than I had ever imagined. I kept expecting her to call or show up at the door, trying to explain herself one more time. But she didn't. She knew there was no going back from this. Even if she had tried, I knew in my heart that I could never look at her the same way again. The trust, the love, everything had been shattered. There was no fixing this. Jake and I talked a few times over the next week. It was strange, really, how we had gone from total strangers to something like allies in this mess. He checked in on me, asking how I was holding up, and I did the same for him. He was hurt too, in a different way. He had been led to believe he was in a real relationship with Jessica, that they had a future together, and now he was dealing with the fallout of her lies just like I was. In a weird way, talking to Jake helped. He understood in a way no one else could. We were both victims of the same deception, and it gave us some kind of twisted solidarity. Neither of us had seen it coming, and neither of us had any real closure. But at least we weren't alone in that. It was Jake, during one of our calls, who brought up the question I had been avoiding. What next? What was I going to do now that the truth was out? Now that Jessica was gone? I don't know, man, I said, my voice hollow over the phone. I guess I just move on? Try to forget this whole thing ever happened. Jake was quiet for a moment before he responded. Yeah, maybe. But it's not something you just forget, Matt. You've been through hell. Give yourself some time to figure it out. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, I guess. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized he was right. This wasn't something I could just walk away from like it never happened. It had changed me, shaken me to my core, and I wasn't the same person I had been before all this. I couldn't just move on without facing the wreckage that was left behind. The divorce process was surprisingly quick. We didn't have kids, and we hadn't been married long enough for things to get too complicated. The settlement was fair, though it didn't matter much to me. At this point, I just wanted it all to be over. Jessica reached out a few times during the divorce, sending long, emotional texts that I barely read. She tried to explain herself, saying she had been overwhelmed by the pressure of being the perfect daughter, wife, and future mother. She said she never wanted to hurt me, that she was sorry for everything she had done. But the words felt empty. Sorry wasn't enough to fix what she had broken. I didn't respond to most of her messages. I couldn't. Every time I saw her name pop up on my phone, it was like a knife twisting in my chest, reopening the wound I was trying to heal. Eventually, she stopped trying, and the silence that followed was both a relief and a reminder of everything that had been lost. Her family didn't take her back easily. Her brother and sister both reached out to me, apologizing for what had happened, telling me how disappointed they were in her. Her mother, once so close to Jessica, barely spoke to her anymore. The betrayal had cut deeper than just my marriage. She had used her own family, her mother's illness, to cover up her lies, and now they were all left to deal with the fallout. In the end, Jessica lost more than just her marriage. She lost the respect of the people she had spent her whole life trying to please. And there was no going back from that. As for me, I started to rebuild. Slowly. It wasn't easy. Some days, I woke up feeling like I was drowning in everything that had happened. Other days, I felt like I was finally coming up for air. It was a process, one that I knew would take time. But one thing was for sure. I wasn't going to let Jessica's lies define the rest of my life. I had a chance to start over, to build something new. And that's exactly what I intended to do. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to return to something resembling normal. The pain of Jessica's betrayal was still there, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. It had dulled, settling into a kind of quiet sadness, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of the lessons I had learned. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends, spending time doing the things I used to enjoy before my world fell apart. It wasn't easy at first. Every time I stepped out the door, I felt a little more exposed, a little more vulnerable. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. If I was going to move on, I had to live my life again. Jake and I kept in touch, though our conversations became less frequent as time went on. He was moving on with his life too, getting back into dating and trying to forget the mess Jessica had dragged us both through. It was strange. We had bonded over something so painful, but in a way, it had helped us both heal. We were no longer victims, no longer bound by the lies she had spun. We were free now, and we both knew it. One night, a few months after the divorce was finalized, I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, looking out over the yard where the barbecue had taken place. It was quiet now, peaceful. The chaos of that day seemed like a distant memory, though the emotions were still fresh. I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the confrontation, the way Jessica had broken down in front of her family. I had gotten the closure I needed, but it had come at a heavy price. The door behind me creaked open, and I turned to see my neighbor, Tom, stepping out to join me. We'd been friends for years, and he had been one of the few people who knew the full story of what had gone down. He didn't ask for details. He just listened when I needed him to. That night, he handed me another beer and sat down beside me without a word. For a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that made you forget, for a moment, all the crap life threw at you. After a while, Tom finally spoke up. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, taking a swig of my beer. "Yeah, I think so. Better than I was, anyway." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Good. You deserve better than what she put you through." I didn't respond right away. I just stared at the last sliver of sun sinking below the trees, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. He was right. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally starting to believe it. "I'm not saying it's been easy," I said after a while, "but I think I'm starting to figure things out. I'm not who I was before all this, but maybe that's a good thing. I'm stronger now. I know what I want out of life, and more importantly, what I don't want." Tom smiled, clinking his beer bottle against mine. "That's what I like to hear." We sat there for a while longer, talking about nothing in particular. Sports, work, the usual small talk. But underneath it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I had been through hell, but I had come out the other side. Jessica's lies had shattered the life we'd built, but they hadn't shattered me. I was still standing, still breathing, and I had a future ahead of me, one that was mine to shape. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I had survived the worst of it, and now I was ready to move on. Whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. As the stars started to appear in the darkening sky, I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. It wasn't going to be easy, but I had a second chance now. A chance to build a life that was real, honest, and mine. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me.